Thank you so much for joining us here today. For those of you who may be new to Truman, we are a community of national security professionals who are committed to principled American foreign policy, policy that takes both power and legitimacy seriously and understands restraint and accountability as strategic strengths rather than weaknesses. This conversation today is part of our Venezuela learning series. And the purpose of this series is really kind of simple. We want to slow this conversation down. Public debate about foreign policy can often lurch from crisis to crisis. And in moments of urgency, the pressure to act can outrun the discipline to understand. And so we want to anchor this conversation and dialogue in facts and history and institutional reality. Our first session a few weeks ago examined lessons from interventions and their aftermath, and today's session is going to focus on the structural foundations of Venezuela's crisis in Latin America more broadly. We're really fortunate to have two practitioners with deep firsthand experience to guide us. I'm honored to welcome Ambassador James Story, who is a retired career U.S. diplomat who served as a U.S. ambassador to Venezuela during one of the most complex periods in bilateral relations. And his decades of service across Latin America gave him direct insight into how diplomacy and pressure and political realities intersect. And I'm equally honored to welcome our very own Amanda Mattingly, founder of ACM Global. And she brings a unique political, economic, and risk analysis lens that's shaped by her experience at the State Department, National Security Council, and U.S. Embassy in Caracas as well. Full bios for each of them, as well as additional details about this conversation and the series are available for download on our website. So I'm going to keep those introductions brief. And then just to remind you that we will have time for Q&A at the end of this session. So please go ahead and submit your questions using that Q&A tool, and we'll get to as many as we can. Thank you all for being here. Let's begin. Over to you, Amanda and Ambassador.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Angelique. Really appreciate it. Very nice intro. And I'm so excited to be with Ambassador Story, who I just recently saw here in Atlanta. So it's good to be with you again.
Yeah, and we'll stick with Jimmy as well. We'll make it easy.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Amanda. Thanks for having me today, y'all.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. Thank you, Jimmy. I really appreciate it. We'll try to pick up a little bit on our conversation from when you were here in Atlanta. But for the benefit of our audience, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit of like some of the history of Venezuela. So when I was in Venezuela, and this was like in the early 2000s, I was serving at the U.S. Embassy in Caracas under Ambassador Shapiro, who you know well, obviously. And so we were really focused at that time on brokering talks between the Venezuelan government under Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan opposition. So this time frame was like after the 2002 military, like very brief military ousting of Chavez and the 2003 national oil strike, okay, that happened. And so at that time, we were trying to get the parties together to agree to conditions for a recall referendum on Chavez, which was afforded in the Constitution of Venezuela. At that time, Venezuelan opposition members were really concerned that Chavez was going to dismantle democratic institutions, nationalize industries, and consolidate power,
Huh.
which ultimately is what happened. But
Right.
how did that happen? So it didn't happen overnight, as you know.
Right. Right.
So can you just tell us, can you walk us through from Chavez to Nicolas Maduro and what happened that the Venezuelan political system evolved from democratic governance to authoritarian control?
Well, it doesn't happen all at once, does it? And I think what's instructive here is some of the things that appeared to be relatively minor at the time were indicative of a direction and were much greater than people had anticipated. That recall referendum of which you referenced, um, right? And what that did was that by putting out people's names publicly and who voted against Chavez, and keeping those people out of government offices, away from government jobs, no more subsidies, you kind of name it, no registering of your house or car, couldn't get your kids in school. I mean, at the time, I came down to 2000. I want to say four or five. I can't quite recall. I think Charles had already left. Ambassador Shapiro had already left. And I was working in fisheries, and I took a young man with me, Yuri Flores, from the embassy, and he was blocked from going into the fisheries ministry because they looked at the lista Tascon and they said, "Well, you voted against Chavez. You're not here." So little things that um, take away people's belief in the system, that the system is working, redound over time in much more nefarious ways. And then it's the packing of the courts and the release of people of any expertise. I say all of this, recognizing that there will be people on this call perhaps who see similar patterns in other countries. Some would see it in our own country. This pattern of undermining institutions. The strength of a democracy is not based on its elections. There are dozens and scores of elections in Venezuela. They don't really matter. It's the institutions that matter. And those were systematically undermined over time, culminating, excuse me, I froze for a second, culminating in 2015 when the National Assembly was won by the opposition. And the regime decided under Maduro, who started in 2013, okay, we're going to create a constituent assembly and we're going to take away power from the National Assembly because they actually had a super majority, but had a few seats stolen from them even there.
Right.
So that was kind of the last straw where that was the last institution. It's the last institution we recognize in the country, even today, is that
Yeah.
2015 National Assembly. So that's kind of how we got here.
Right. 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 Not overnight, but little by little. I remember the National Electoral Council, that being significant. Once those 5 seats were held by the government, that meant elections were, you know, I mean, basically rendered a farce, as we
Right,
saw certainly in 2024.
right, right.
So, okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. So to January 3rd, if you will, of this year.
Skipped a
So
lot. Yeah, okay.
it feels like a while ago now, but okay. So the rationale, or like let's say pretext, if you will, depending on your view, under which the Trump administration went into Caracas and apprehended Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd was narcoterrorism. Um, so Maduro had been in, as we all know, or I'm sure many people on the call, they know this by now, that Maduro had been indicted under U.S. law. And according to the Trump administration, the U.S. military was supporting law enforcement exercise to apprehend Maduro. So, say what you will about this rationale. It's actually, for those of you who are not steeped in Latin American history, it's very similar to the rationale that former President George H.W. Bush had for going in to oust Manuel Noriega from Panama in 1989. But okay, say what you will about the rationale, but clearly Maduro's claim to power was backed by, at the very least, whether that was narcoterrorism or not, we'll debate in a minute, but at the very least, a corrupt Venezuelan military and government apparatus, right, that benefited from patronage politics. Well, first of all, would you agree with that, Jimmy? And then if so, like, how does corruption, patronage politics, specifically in Venezuela, operate, or how had it under Maduro to get
Right.
to this point?
I think it's important to go back a little bit and let's just lay out what Venezuela never really was, which was a robust democracy. And I have a lot of
Okay.
Venezuelan friends who'll take exception to me saying that, but it's true. They had this pacto de punto fijo between two major political parties, COPEI and the ADECOS, the AD. And they would basically, one party's in power, the other party runs PDVSA, and then the other party's in power and the other party runs PDVSA as kind of the checks and balances. Not super democratic. And frankly, given the Dutch disease that comes from having too many natural resources and not having a broader base of economic activity, they had plenty of problems with exchange rate fluctuation, utilizing multiple exchange rates, and access to the goose with the golden eggs, which was PDVSA or oil industry at large. What I'm suggesting here is that corruption is not unique to the Chavez Maduro regime. What I will say is that this endemic corruption that's been around in Venezuela because of the basis upon which the economy is built
Right.
became industrialized under this Chavez Maduro regime. Maduro became the Henry Ford of corruption. Everything was built around the model of corruption. And frankly, I was surprised he lasted 6 months when he came in because I
Mhm.
didn't know if he knew all of the corrupt mechanisms that had been established, either from the generals with gold mines or in the Ciudad Guyana in the industrial area where they were taking apart, basically taking apart these companies and selling them from scrap. You also have the drug trafficking with the Cartel of the Suns. You have all manner of engagement in economic activity and illegality by all types of people across the government. And then they also people who had access to this differences in exchange rates. I mean, imagine if you could buy 100 bolivars for $1 and then sell the same 100 bolivars for $20. Well, if you could do that, it's printing money, right? And that was
Right.
happening. That actually happened
Mhm.
before Chavez. It really started happening later on. So yeah, as I said on 60 Minutes, this group of people is a they're a criminal organization masquerading as a government. I think your bigger question, sorry, I'm joining on here a little bit, Amanda. I warned you
No,
about
it's
this.
fine. Please.
Your bigger question of, well, did it take military force to get him out? And you compared it to Manuel Noriega in 1989 and Operation Just
Mhm.
Cause. And I would submit that we had run out of options. And what's really interesting here is the fact that most people polled in Latin America are appreciative of the fact. But it's much more popular in Latin
Yeah.
America that we did this than it is in the United States, which is kind of unprecedented.
Yep.
Um, yeah, well, I'm sure we'll dig into this a little bit more. So let me stop there.
Yeah, no, well, this gets to my next question, which is let's go back to the narco-terrorism. I think it is really interesting that you said we had run out of options, and you had been very much involved in the support of, I guess, Juan Guaido and the 2019 sort of strategy that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration had put in place, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken. So it is interesting. We had gone through many options for sure. But narco terrorism. Obviously, the war on drugs in Latin America, this is not anything new. And this is not going to be, a news flash to anyone on this call, right? I mean, we've been running counter narcotics operations in the region for years, decades. I mean, you think about like the Merida Initiative in Mexico or the Tri-Border Initiative in the Caribbean, Plan Colombia, millions of dollars, right? For a long period of time. But Venezuela was not a major player in terms of drug production or trafficking. Certainly not in the same way that Colombia or Mexico have been. Um, but I mean, had it and we just didn't know, or like, like where
No,
can you explain, Jimmy, to us?
yeah.
Like, does this rationale make sense when you think about Venezuela? And you had mentioned the Cartel de los Soles and also Tren de Aragua. Are these real cartels? Is this a euphemism? Like, wh where does Venezuela stand in the region in terms of narco terrorism?
Well, I'll tell you everything I said on television leading up to January 3rd, which was having the experience of running counter narcotics in Colombia for Plan Colombia for 3 years,
Yep.
2010 to 13. And then I ran counter narcotics for the Western Hemisphere from 13 to 15. When we put that many resources into the Caribbean, it had nothing to do with counter narcotics, really. It was about regime change, which is what we did. Um, I personally believe that blowing up these boats, these go fast, is bad policy and is going to redound negatively on us internationally. It's going to have a direct impact on intelligence sharing from other countries and
Right.
we lose intelligence by doing it this way.
I agree.
And you'll notice that most of the boats that are being destroyed aren't coming from Venezuela. It's because only about 10% of all cocaine flows from South America come through Venezuela. It's a relatively minor player. Off the coast of of Ecuador, out towards the Galapagos and the Westpac area, much bigger. Um, but drug trafficking organizations can change their modalities, and they don't have a problem making a profit. What I find fascinating is that allegedly we've decreased go fasts from South America by 97%. Last week, the DEA came out with a new price of cocaine in the United States that's gone down.
Oh,
Now,
nice.
look, I went to public schools in South Carolina, but I remember the supply and demand curve. So that's telling me if the price is down, the demand hasn't changed, supply is up. So, you know, I I think it was a pretext. It was a bit of a fig leaf, a very see-through one at that, transparent one at that. It, but when we talk about what we have done, we have attempted negotiations scores of times between this dictatorship that's also under indictment for crimes against humanity
Right.
that has forced out almost 9 million Venezuelans, which is destabilizing to the region.
Oh,
They
yes.
have regularly tortured and killed their own citizens, as well as arrested and tortured American citizens, many of whom I helped get out by negotiating with that regime back in 22. So, these are bad actors, and even the opposition, when Trump won, when we recognized Juan Guaido constitutionally as president, according to their constitution, um, they were asking for the Rio Treaty to be invoked, which is kind of like an Article 5 type NATO thing, where it's like, hey, we need protection, right? And they did need protection. They do need protection. And we had gone through every type of negotiation you possibly could. In fact, I think the negotiation under Biden ended up being pretty positive writ large because it led to the mistake of the regime allowing a vote to happen, not thinking they could lose it, right? I mean, in these dictatorships, you
And
have
you're
to
talking the
the question.
2024 vote.
Yeah, July 2024.
Right.
Um, so all that to say is we had gone through just about every option, and in the region, the leaders that have been most outspoken, although relatively muted in in how they've approached the United States and what we've done. Petro out of Colombia, Lula out of Brazil, to a lesser extent, Sheinbaum out of Mexico.
Yep.
In particular, with Petro and Lula, they specifically asked for the proof, according to the Constitution, they have to show the proof in Venezuela that Maduro had won. They didn't have the proof, never presented it. Meanwhile, the opposition could prove that they did win.
Right. Explain that for
Yeah,
everybody's benefit again. The
right.
2024 election. What happened?
So what happened leading up to the election, like you were talking about earlier with the opposition, trying to get them organized, we helped them get organized, and they created something called the Unitary Platform.
Hmm.
Set of rules, democratic rules, and I think it's good when democratic actors don't agree with each other all the time. That's democracy. So everybody says, well, the opposition needs to be united. I'm like, democratic actors have different points of view. You know, Fetterman out of Pennsylvania is not similar to AOC out of New York for the Democratic side, right? I could say
Right.
something about the Republican side. So so they got organized, and while we were doing this negotiation, they we were helping them get organized, and then they decided to have a primary, which was a very good idea. Maria Corina Machado, I worked with her, and she agreed to run in it. It originally had not wanted to, because she wasn't part of that interim government thing that we had earlier that
Right.
we
And
still
M-
recognize, right?
Maria Corina, for everybody, is the Nobel laureate,
Yeah.
major opposition figure in Venezuela.
And in 2019, she was major, but she didn't have many seats in Congress. So she wasn't really a big player with the interim government, but she recognized that she was the voice of the majority of Venezuelans at that point in time. She won the primary, and the regime blocked her from running for president. So she named another woman to run in her stead who had never held public office. Nobody ever talks about her. And she was blocked from running for no reason whatsoever, other than the fact that she was probably a woman and her name was too close to Maria Corina Machado's name. Then Maria Corina came up with this little known diplomat, Edmundo González Urrutia. And the regime said, fine, he can run, never thinking that they would win 70% of the vote. And they did because they
Right.
knew they were voting for Maria Corina.
Right. And remind us, how did they know that the opposition had won?
At
Like what?
each polling site, at each precinct, you have to pull together what are called actas, and they showed who voted and how they voted. And very cleverly, the decision had been taken. I used the passive voice early on to gather these actas, improve through a mechanism online, upload the actas. Interestingly enough, members of the National Guard of Venezuela were giving these actas over as well because they tried to control all of this. They ended up getting about 87% of the voting tallies, the sheets from
Right.
individual precincts. And with that, they proved that they won. The law in Venezuela says you have to publish that those actas by precinct. And the regime never provided the proof that they won. So, former foreign minister and Lula confidant Celso Amorin
Hmm.
goes to Venezuela and he leaves without proof, asks for the proof, leaves without proof. So when they say, oh, Maduro, United States sovereignty, you shouldn't have done what you did, everything else, they weren't they weren't really as loud as they could have been. But I also asked the question, where were you when they lost a vote and they stole the election? Why weren't you more vocal about Maduro stealing the election?
Right. Which they were not. Yes.
They weren't. They weren't.
Right. Right. Okay, let's go back, if you would. You had mentioned the like oil factor, if you will. I think this is just absolutely key to understanding Venezuela. Again, so when I was in Caracas, I was told, look, Venezuela is, was, and will always be about the oil. So, like, if this is how you, like, this is how you need to understand this country. And that was at that time, so this is like in the early 2000s, this was the peak of Venezuelan oil production. So this was about like 3.5 million barrels a day. Um, then after that period, this was under Chavez, as we all may remember, that the oil prices spiked. It then was able to fund Chavez's social programs that were expansive at that time. And then, but what they didn't do was like reinvest in the oil sector, and even less so than under Maduro after he comes in, as I understand it. Um, so then production decreases, as we know. And also that coincided with oil prices decrease, global crude prices decreasing, right?
Right.
So I want to know a little bit from your perspective how the role of oil plays out and how that intersects with some of the politics inside Venezuela and like the elite incentives, if you will, or the economic factors around oil that then leads to, I guess, maybe Maduro's entrenchment or not, in your view.
If you're in an oil state and oil's $140 a barrel, it's easy to be considered a genius, right? I mean, they had so much money. They were sending oil. Chavez was sending oil to the United States for free, heating oil just to needle
Yep.
Obama at the time. And I believe it was Obama at the time. And when Maduro came in, oil plummeted to something like $35 a barrel.
Yep.
And the lift price, break even price is optimistically in the mid to upper 40s. Today, it's a lot higher than that. So I do think that oil's always going to play a role in Venezuela, but I think they may be a post-oil state. I don't see. You didn't ask this question exactly this way. I'll get back to like like capture by elites and stuff like that.
Sure.
Nobody's going to invest in that country. under the current circumstances. And I have another piece coming out in MS Now, and I've been talking a lot. I was just up in New York speaking at the New York Bar Association, Alexander Hamilton Society. You don't have rule of law and sanctity of contracts. You don't have institutionality, and then the economics aren't good. Um, Venezuela, in Venezuelans in general, have a tendency to think that the world wants what they have. They don't recognize that the world has options. You can go to Guyana and get oil. You can go to Oman and get oil. You can go to Angola and get oil, Brazil and get oil. It doesn't, they have a lot of oil, sure. They have oil that's good for U.S. refineries on the Gulf Coast because it's sour crude and you can make more things out of it, sure. But you can get that stuff other places, right?
With
Um,
less risk.
there's less, yeah, the risk profile is way high. And institutional investors are just not going to go because they're responsive to their shareholders and they've got know your customer constraints. And look, some private equity people I talk to and work with, they're going to get in and they'll do something on the margins and they'll make some money maybe. But oil, going back to 3.5 million, who's going to invest $100 billion? Uh, and I'll tell you, capital is a coward. It's not going to go to a place like that. What has happened in Venezuela, Chavez attempted to use some of that money to bring people out of poverty, like Lula did in Brazil, and he was
Right.
successful in some of that. And let's be
Right.
clear,
These were the social programs that
yeah,
the oil funded.
and let's be clear, Chavez was democratically elected. People like the guy. He was a great politician.
People loved him. I
Yeah,
remember.
and they still love him. Now, you know, and then he does what all populists do is they get way too enamored of themselves. I don't care if you're on the right or the left. If you're a populist, you just end up on the dark side of the moon together. Look, you got another one, Bukele. He's actually from the left, but he's acting like he's from the right. I don't know. He's jumped the shark for me because he changed the Constitution to run indefinitely, just like Chavez did. They become enamored of their own inestimable worth, that only they have the answers. And that's not democratic, and it's not good, and it's not healthy. You have to have a healthy debate, and you have to have moving around. So, anyway, the oil industry, Chavez attempted to diversify. They built some aluminum smelters in the east and some steel mills and a fertilizer plant inside of Colombia. They did try to create other forms of income, but the easy money from oil was just addictive. It was a
Yeah.
sugar high. And everybody looked at how could they put their finger in the stream of money flowing out of PDVSA and get a piece for themselves. So it created this corrupt environment about who gets what contract and how much do I really need to do. I mean, you mentioned earlier Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua was an actual project funded by the Chinese in which all of the money was stolen. It was a train project. And the people working on the project ended up not getting paid and they turned to criminality. And now it's, a foreign terrorist organization, according to the administration.
Right.
I
Wow.
have my quibbles on that. But that's what oil has been, the resource curse issue in Venezuela. And as I think about a Venezuela of the future, when I talk to people who are interested in investing in Venezuela, I say, well,
Hmm.
I wouldn't invest right now, but when there's a transition, agriculture. They used to be self-sufficient. They have some of the best chocolate in the world. Why aren't you focused in there? Not everything has to be about resource extraction. Although, if you have the most oil in the world and you have the critical minerals, it's going to be part of the future. It just not under the current circumstances, in which it's the same dictatorship under new management.
Right. 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 I mean, isn't that what the ExxonMobil CEO said in the White House or
Yeah,
in January? Like
it's
right now,
uninvestable.
uninvestable. Right. I think that speaks to issues of like rule of law, contract law, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And there's just still so much risk. What did you mean by post oil state? I think that was the phrase you used.
I just say that I'm like if they don't figure out how to get a transition off the ground and rebuild institutions, I I, I don't know if they're ever going to get back to 3.5 million barrels of oil. I don't I
I see. Yep.
That's what I meant by that. I don't know
Got
if they're
it.
going to be a big player in this space. As technology improves and people look, I think oil is always going to have a place. I watch Landman just like the rest of y'all, and that's what I know. But I think oil is going to have a place, but you can get it elsewhere. You don't have to get it specifically from there. There are other things. They have a lot of water. They have a lot of fertile land, and they also have critical minerals, a lot of gold,
Yeah, the rare
coltan, things of
earths.
this, rare earths.
Yep.
There are other opportunities here. So
Yeah.
I probably oversaid it when I said post oil, but at some point, the demand for oil it shifts, and if you get it elsewhere, then Venezuela is missing out on opportunity. And let's also not forget, since 2013, their GDP has contracted 85%.
Yeah.
So go to your AI and say, if I grow at 5% per year after losing 85%, how long does it take for me to get back where I was?
Right.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so um, let's talk about the U.S. politics in this and some of the
Sure.
U.S. domestic politics.
Sure.
So one of the things that's interesting, and you just mentioned this, is in many ways we went from like an anti-American authoritarian dictatorship government to now a pro-American one. It's really the same government, just less Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. But I thought that Venezuelan Americans and Cuban Americans wanted a democratic transition, democracy, human rights. Like I thought that was something that they're interested in. So, okay, help us understand this, if you would, from your view, and how maybe more generally, let's help the folks in the audience understand the U.S. domestic politics and how that
Yeah.
plays into U.S. foreign policy decisions, specifically in Latin America. As you and I know, they are
Right.
significant.
I find it interesting, and just a couple of things as I'm thinking about my response here. One, under Trump one, he didn't provide temporary protective status to migrants from Venezuela, but Biden did.
Yep.
And in fact, Trump is now deporting people who have TPS in some cases, and still they're with him, it's beggared my belief for me. The other domestic
They
policy,
being,
they
I'm
being
sorry, they,
Venezuelans.
yep,
Venezuelans, like talking about Venezuelans. Venezuelans support Trump. They do,
yep,
and especially after January 3rd. But my
yep,
point is, Biden didn't get any shine for doing TPS, which surprised me, frankly. What temporary protective status that allows him to stay in the United States and get a job, be protected.
right.
Um, didn't it didn't get any bounce from that. So as I think about where domestically does Latin America really matter for domestic politics, it's always been Florida. But Florida was always considered a purple state, meaning um, that the Cuban issue was that third rail of American politics because you had to be careful if you're a Democrat not to be too soft, if you're a Republican not to be too hard, you had to be the Goldilocks because you wanted the Florida electoral votes. I would submit to this group of very smart individuals that Florida has become Mississippi with better beaches. In other words, it's a deep red state, and
Yeah.
no amount of convincing is going to fix it. Now, we can quibble about this. Yes, they just elected a Democratic mayor in Miami for the first time in like 40 years or something. Um, Yes, there are some districts that are in flux, and but Venezuela is a very bipartisan issue because of that.
Yeah.
In Florida, you got Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Mario Diaz-Balart hanging out together as part of the Venezuela caucus all the time. So it matters to some extent, but on the electoral map, if you're running for president, it doesn't matter from my perspective. Now, what is the U.S. calendar? Why does the U.S. electoral calendar matter to the Venezuelans? The regime, the dictatorship, Delcy Rodriguez, they're waiting us out. They're waiting until November. And what they're going to do, and of this I'm quite convinced, I'm watching them
Okay.
in real time. And again, I submit to you, I've written on this just last week. I published a piece in MS Now about one Pablo Guanipa, a friend of
Uh-huh.
mine who was released. He did an interviews on somebody put a TV in his face and a camera in his face, and he said, "Yeah, we need elections." Rearrested, and now he's under house arrest.
Juanita is a Venezuelan opposition figure.
Yeah, Venezuelan opposition figure, really outspoken. He won a governorship in 2017 and refused to swear an oath of fealty to that constituent assembly I told you about earlier because it
Right.
was anti-constitutional, anti-democratic. In any event, this catch and release, they're releasing some political prisoners, not all of them. The
Yeah.
hydrocarbon law is kind of okay, but not great. The amnesty law is kind of okay, but not great. Huge problems in the amnesty law. So they're giving us just enough. Like imagine you're fishing and you've hooked a fish. You don't want to pull the line too tight, right? So they're just playing us along in the hopes that in
Right.
November the Democrats win the lower house, win the House of Representatives, and somehow constrain the President of the United States and what he's doing in Venezuela. That's what they're playing for.
Right.
That's what they've done at every one of those negotiations. The Vatican, Mexico, Barbados, you name it. That's how they've done it. That's how they're doing it again. I would submit, and I'm not trying to push my own publications, but I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We put out a
Mhm.
memo to the president a couple weeks ago, and we laid out make the hard ass now when you have maximum leverage on this regime. So your domestic political situation, they know us very well, and they're buying time to make sure to see if they can't continue to stay in power by working around Trump.
Right. 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 You don't see a timetable for elections, for example, but maybe that's something we should be pressing for while we've got maximum leverage.
100%. And the
Yep.
opposition, I love to talk about Freud's narcissism of minor differences. Because if you took all of the people who hate each other in the opposition for whatever reason, they agree on about 97% of things. Now I get it. We share
Yeah.
DNA with chimpanzees at like 98%. So I get like 2% can be big. But in politics, not so much. DNA is
Right.
one thing, politics is another. They just got to,
Right.
they need to all be talking about when are we going to have elections?
Yes.
And
I
that's it.
agree. Okay, so what about elsewhere in the region? There are clearly U.S. foreign policy imperatives in Latin America that have played into, in some way, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela. So I'm thinking about Cuba, I'm thinking about Colombia, about Mexico, USMCA. So in many ways, like shifting dynamics in the region and our own national security strategy under Trump, which is about like immigration, economic dominance, if you will, spheres of influence. This is all in some ways made the intervention in Venezuela possible, or at least it's part of it, right? So, but am I right there, or like how, in your view, how do
Yeah.
you think Venezuela fits into this like sort of larger U.S. Latin America strategy, or even geopolitical strategy?
Well, Venezuela was a country that was riddled with foreign terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah. It still may have it there. It allowed Iran into the region in a way that we had never seen before. It was in bed with our strategic competitors, China and Russia.
Yep.
And Russia was using Venezuela as a platform to destabilize the region, frankly. This is where they were using their bot armies to go after different people. I mean, they were being very, very effective in their approach. For the Chinese, it was more of a long-term commercial play, not so much, not as nefarious, but they still did things that I take exception with, such as the Carnet de la Patria, the fatherland card, which is a social
Hmm.
control mechanism in the country. And certainly they wanted to get access to all those natural resources, right? And they
Yes,
and they
for
still
sure.
want that. So how does it play? If you read from back in November, the national security strategy, I think it was smart and the right thing to do to focus on the Western Hemisphere because that which happens in this hemisphere has a bigger impact on us as citizens of the United States than anywhere else in the world. Now, having said that, one would hope we would not abdicate global responsibility, be it in Europe or Asia. And I do think uh, that we need to be careful in the attack against institutions that have created this. unprecedented period of prosperity for the United States and for the world since the end of World War II. I think we have to be careful with how we treat those. Threatening Denmark over Greenland was not a smart call, especially when whatever this deal was that we got on Greenland was just the same deal that we always had on Greenland, right? We shut down
Right.
11 military bases and left one. We weren't forced out. So I think we have to be a little careful with some of the rhetoric, but what does it mean locally? All right. Well, this operation was so tactically stunning that it does serve notice to our strategic competitors that our ability to operate is on a different level than everybody else's.
Yep.
And it is. Um, Now, I don't know about this discombobulator people are talking about. I got to learn more about that. If that's true, it means the Havana syndrome was true, right? That we were being attacked
Yep.
by some kind of a sound weapon. But let's say it serves notice on our military capabilities. I think it also serves notice that the president, even though he doesn't like getting into conflict, is willing to use force. Operation Midnight Hammer, or whatever it was called in Iran, for instance,
Right.
the killing of Soleimani as well, the IRGC head. So that
Right. The
these are
threats right now against Iran.
right, and we have two flat tops over there in the region, and the odds of
Hmm.
something happening, I think, have increased in the short term with the Supreme Court decision that just came out a few minutes ago
Yes.
against the
Hmm.
IEEPA. Frankly, so in any event, um, and I was saying the tail's wagging the dog here. I see it ramping up in much the same way I saw things ramping up in Venezuela. Now, the it we are able now to push out our strategic competitors from Venezuela, and it's a big prize. And I think we're also showing we're putting them on notice more largely across the region. For Cuba in particular, this is existential.
Yes.
They lived off of free or subsidized oil from Russia until the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
and then almost immediately Chavez showed up and bailed them out. And you'll notice I was saying this years ago. So as soon as Venezuela is dealt with, the Mexicans will show up to help out Cuba because there's a lot of affinity there, and they did. But
And they
we served
did.
notice to Sheinbaum on that front, and she stopped sending them subsidized oil. So I definitely think that the president's the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is bringing back the we're going to have preeminence in the hemisphere. I don't know how that's going to redound long term. I think we can have a healthy debate about whether or not gunboat diplomacy redounds positively on your shared relationships. You know, I personally believe working through multilateral institutions and bilateral agreements and having free trade agreements and making win-win opportunities probably gives you access to the kinds of trade that is beneficial to you as a country. Like we need access to lithium and cobalt and these rare earths. Well, we should just get into agreements to buy those things, right? And as long as we're trading with China, they're going to trade with China. I mean, 42% of Chile's exports go straight to China. I mean,
Right.
they can't stop, right? So I do think I think this is where the really interesting thing for me is looking forward. How does this play out in the region over
Yeah.
time? Politically,
Yeah.
you see a shift in the region back to the right, which I
Hmm.
find
For sure.
interesting. Is this because of what Trump did, or is his engagement in Honduras, for instance? Uh,
Hmm.
Releasing a real criminal, Juan Orlando Hernandez, did that help in getting his party back in power in Honduras? I don't know.
Right. Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, you had mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but you know, people throughout Latin America applauded the ousting of Maduro. People were
Yeah.
very happy in the region that this happened. I've told other people this, but on the morning of January 3rd, I got an early morning text from a friend of mine in Mexico who said, glad your SOB got rid of their SOB. Like, I mean, I think it's pretty telling. People across the region were very happy. And, Maduro didn't have many friends, right? Like, I mean, let's like with the exception of Cuba, but like as you mentioned, there was, sort of a tepid response even from Petro and Lula and Sheinbaum.
Right.
Because, I
Right.
mean, as we talked about, he grossly mismanaged the Venezuelan economy. He committed human rights violations against his own people. He created the largest humanitarian disaster in the region in its history.
Right.
I mean, millions of Venezuelans had to flee.
Right.
So, he didn't have many friends. But this is also a region, as you and I know well, that is not liked U.S. intervention, right? And does not like threats against their sovereignty. So I just wonder, what does it mean in the long term for U.S. Latin America relations, particularly if the Cuban regime falls as well, like let's say that happens this year. Um, there's just a lot of nostalgia for Cuba in the region. I just wonder what have we gained? What have we lost by U.S. military action in Venezuela in this way?
I mean, it's a tough question to unpack, right? Even super far left leaders in the region like Boric from Chile
Hmm.
hated Maduro, right? So is it just getting rid of somebody that nobody likes that's actually cost there was a huge cost to the region of Maduro being in power. Well, he hurt the leftist brand even though he wasn't a leftist. And then with 25% of the population out of the country, those people need services in other places, right? So it was a problem for the region.
Right. It
Um,
was a problem for us, but it was a real problem in Colombia
Oh,
and
yeah,
Brazil.
3 million in Colombia alone, right? And they're coming out of a
Yep.
52-year civil war. So I think it really matters how this ends up, which is why I think that the president's framing is wrong, moving forward. And again, I am so happy that Maduro is in jail. I couldn't have been more ecstatic when I was awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning to get on TV to start talking about something I knew nothing about. Um, I am ecstatic. Uh,
Right.
but the press conference afterwards, when it was clear that we didn't have a plan, and the president mentioned oil and natural resources 20 times and never mentioned democracy, concerns me. I think the focus has got to be on liberty writ large, and justice writ large, and human rights, and self-determination. The fact of the matter is, the sovereignty of Venezuela had already been attacked by Maduro himself. I mean, I hate to get legalistic here, but sovereignty resides in the people. The people had made a sovereign decision, and he usurped the sovereignty there. So I think it matters. That matters. I think that's an argument that people can live with, as long as this doesn't turn into a vassal state of the United States and we continue to run their economy the way we want to run it, and they don't have the opportunity to decide for themselves. I don't know about Cuba. I think that, as you well know, Amanda, the State Department halls are littered with the careers of people that thought that they were going to be work on Cuba and get this thing to a new
Yep.
relationship. Um, Maybe this time it works. I think timing is everything. I wonder how Secretary Rubio, who I thought did a spectacular job in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a couple months too late, but he did a spectacular job. I thought his Munich speech was he's got chops, and I know him well. I used to brief him
Right.
often. I think how do you run to be president, Rubio, if somehow you do the same play in Cuba that you did in Venezuela, which is work with remnants of the regime, right? I mean, in Panama, we got rid of Noriega and helped install the person who won the election. In Iraq, I mean, and I was a big proponent, don't do de-Baathification, right? Don't get rid of the Ba'athist Party, which we did in Iraq.
Right.
It's like in Venezuela, don't get rid of everybody in the military. Don't do de-Baathifications. I was saying this before January the 3rd. But in the case of Iraq, we didn't put Uday and Qusay in charge, Saddam's sons, right? There was a regime change, all right? And there was a regime change in Panama. There's no regime change in Venezuela. And I do wonder, like, what happens next will be determinative of how this is read over time in the region. I think right
Right.
now we're in an okay place. Let's talk in 6 months, because if we
Right.
haven't made direct progress towards those liberty and justice and democracy questions, it probably won't end up well.
Right. And that those questions of liberty, democracy, human rights, those are So, they are at the core of our organization at Truman and the Truman members. So you're speaking our
Right.
language there. Um, and I think that's a good place to maybe open it up for questions. And here's Angelique to help us with that.
And I am going to take the liberty of actually picking up on that thread and asking my own question to kick things off. Because I've heard you
Great.
talk about, and this really resonated with me at the beginning when you said, elections aren't what makes a democracy, it's the institutions that make a democracy. And then sort of picking up on this thread of like what happens in the next 6 months. I look at Venezuela and I say, how and which institutions you're going to prioritize first? Because rooting out corruption when it's become so endemic, I've worked on a lot of places back when I worked in the State Department, and I don't think I've ever successfully done it or found out what the mystery is for how you do it. Where do you start with Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There are a couple of ways I would approach it. I have a kind of my own personal list of things that have to happen. And again, I put some of those in the memo to the president that we released a few weeks ago. But one way dictatorships can stay in power is through dividing the vote. And Delsey's got 25, maybe they could get to 30%. They need to have second round voting. I think it requires a constitutional change so that you have to have 50% plus one. That'll avoid the kind of games they play. They need to, there is a national mechanism by which judges are chosen. They need to clean out the Supreme Court and other higher institutions and bring in new judges. They're going to have to do all elections under international observation. But you're right, this is not an overnight deal. But I would say, the opposition won an unfair election in July 2024 with the worst circumstances. If you just do a few things, your National Electoral Commission is five independent authorities from academia. That's it. Boom. You start bringing in new judges, in particular judges into the Constitutional Court, the people who review some of these decisions that are made in the Supreme Court, okay, as you're building others. And when they call elections, they need to call general elections for everything. In other words, the new National Assembly, mayors, governors, president, everybody, and universities. The Chavistas blocked all university. This is so weird to me, right? So the Maduro regime blocked universities from voting. And generally speaking, universities are hotbeds of socialist thinking and communist, right? No, that shows you that there's no ideology behind this group of criminals. They're not, it's not like liberal students voting to continue this dictatorship. So even universities, there's going to have to be national reconciliation. Nobody's going to be happy with the outcome. Um, and there's going to have to be some like truth and reconciliation type of mechanism. There are also a couple of really bad actors who need to leave. Diosdado Cabello is not going to be rehabilitated anytime soon. He needs to exit stage right, stage left, stage up, stage down. Don't care. Got to go.
Yeah.
So I do think some of this can work, but rebuilding institutions is a generational issue.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm struck by the reality that would be a massive program if the State Department offices that focused on reconstruction and stabilization still existed at their depth.
Well, I mean, can you imagine if we had look, I think USAID needed to have some revamping, some reworking, but the expertise there in building governmental systems and helping people, we got to recreate that now.
Yeah.
So it's going to be slower, less effective, more expensive to start from scratch. Ultimately, a bad idea to get rid of it rather than just try to reform
Yeah. Well, with that overwhelming thought in mind, I'll turn now to questions
it.
from the audience. That just exhausts me even thinking about rebuilding the institutions. But you're right. I mean, it's what needs to be done. Um,
Right, right.
and but at any rate, we have a question from Brian, and then I'll just give a heads up. We have time probably for maybe one or two more questions after that, if anybody's got a burning question. So Brian asks, what precedent does the Trump administration's 2026 intervention in Venezuela set for future offensive cyber operations against narcoterrorism, And how might targeting criminal networks through state infrastructure, aka power grid, oil export systems, comms networks, reshape norms around legitimacy, escalation, and civilian harm in cyber conflict? That's a really interesting question.
I mean, I need a PhD to
I know.
understand the question. I don't know if I'm smart enough to respond to the question, right? Amanda, you got thoughts?
I mean, I have thoughts on the legality of, we're targeting criminal networks through state infrastructure. I mean, where there are civilians who are working. I mean, when I think of state infrastructure in Venezuela, I mean, we're talking really about like the grid, PDVSA, so is that something that we're going to be expanding on elsewhere? I mean, in some ways, maybe is that what we are doing? And I mean, not in a cyber capacity, but we're targeting like Cuba's infrastructure right now. So I don't know. I mean, I think the cyber, I don't know the legality of that, and I don't know what that looks like. And I'm not sure that Venezuela, at least it strikes me, I don't know that Venezuela is a good, like, I don't think that's setting precedent in that space in terms of like cyber attacks.
I've got two reactions, and then we'll go to some other questions. And my apologies, because it is a great question. One reaction is, generally we do covert action through the CIA, and the lawyers don't approve anything that can have collateral damage to civilian populations. So I don't believe that the operation really brought down the entirety of the grid or stopped electricity from going to hospitals and this kind of thing. That when we hit Venezuela on the third, for me the precedent is a little more global, and does it give the an opening? Okay, we removed an illegal leader, right? In parentheses, um, uh, who we found to be breaking U.S. and international law, yada, yada, yada. Does that give Xi the ability to do the same thing in Taiwan? Now, Putin never felt constrained by international norms. And somebody hit me up with this in New York just yesterday, trying to compare this to Putin, and but we're just doing the same thing Putin's doing, but Putin didn't try to get Zelensky. I'm like, yeah, he did. He would have killed Zelensky the first day if he could have, or captured him if he could have, but they couldn't. They had a bad battle plan, and they got smoked trying to get to Kyiv. So, I don't think Putin needed precedent setting to do something nefarious. Some others may, and that's a good question to unpack. The whole might makes right, the whole return to a late 19th century kind of construct of spheres of influence, this pre-World War II model. I think we could potentially be entering dangerous waters.
Yeah, I would agree specifically with respect to Taiwan, and I'm not sure that I've received an answer that's what would we do then if that is the case? Like it seems to me that part of the national security strategy as laid out by the administration is, well, that's not our sphere of influence.
Right. It's a big question. Well, then
Yeah,
she
which I think
just
should be
fired all the
concerning.
generals. So I don't
Right,
know.
right.
Right.
So we have one more question in the chat, which I'm actually going to reframe a little bit just because I don't want this to go into a partisan direction if I can help it. So I'll reframe the question to say from Stephanie, how do we make people more generally aware, our politicians across the aisle in both places? And I am going to add into this, I think, key stakeholders throughout the country in the US. How do we make them as aware and appreciative of the importance of our own hemisphere?
Well, I mean, I'm on the road every week talking to people, and I think there's a role for that. Um, educating people, though, you need to have both wholesale and retail. I'm doing a lot of retail, 150 people here, 200 people there, but where's the wholesale pitch? And I think, that needs to come, that needs to come from the administration. I'm personally very happy that there's a focus on the Western Hemisphere. Um, I thought the question was going to go in a different direction when you said partisan. How do we get back to the center in America, which is a completely different question. I've got an answer for it, but I won't bore you all to tears with that right now. But look, even when I was at Georgetown, I was sitting in one of the class, and one of my colleagues was helping teach the class, and he didn't know who the number one trading partner with the United States was because he said somebody other than Mexico. I'm like, guy, like, what happens in Mexico matters in the United States of America. What happens in Canada matters. The amount of trade that goes back and forth. And I get what the president's doing, like he just said, well, maybe we don't have a North American trade agreement without Canada. He's trying to position himself to get something more or to claim a victory. I think the world's figuring it out. Like something like 90% of the time when he says he's going to do a tariff, he doesn't do it. And now with the Supreme Court decision from earlier today, I wonder by what mechanism he will do it. I mean, all of us on this call are smart enough to know who pays for the dang tariffs. All
Yep.
of us on this call are smart enough to know that mercantilistic approaches to international commerce don't work long term. But anyway, how do we get people to know? I don't know. Education.
Yeah. Well, I would say having, I mean, as a Latin Americanist, if you will, having worked on the region for now long time, I would say that when people policymakers think about Latin America and the US, they primarily think about drugs and migrants over the long term. That's
Yeah,
been
yeah,
like
true.
they've seen it through the prism of risk as opposed to through the prism of opportunity and alliances. For a while, we were focused on trade, and obviously, as Ambassador Story just mentioned, less so now. I think that I am also really happy that there is focus on the region where there hasn't been for a long time. But I would like to move it more to what are the opportunities that we have to work with our partners in Latin America? What is it that makes our hemisphere stronger? What is it that makes North America stronger? We have USMCA, which is our free trade agreement, is up for review this year. There's
Mhm.
a lot of opportunity for North America and I mean we're hosting the World Cup together. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity, and I'm really hopeful that that these kinds of conversations help to move the needle. So I'm really grateful,
100%.
Angelique, for you organizing this for that reason.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for both of you for coming, and it warms my heart. I mean, I think this is a nice place to end the conversation on because I think that's a really optimistic tone, right? I know I spent my entire state career thinking about Latin America through the lens of Colombia because of the time that I was there. And I think this
Right.
notion of thinking about it through the lens of opportunity and looking at what those opportunities can be, even if it will take some massive effort, is a really great frame to close out this conversation. Any final thoughts from either of our wonderful guests? Thank you so much, both of you, for coming.
No, just
Thank
a big
you.
thank you.
It's
Yeah.
been great fun, Jimmy. I loved it.
Yeah, me too. Nice to see y'all, and thanks for the opportunity. Reach out on LinkedIn. You can find me quite easily, and if there's anybody who has a follow-on question and wants to engage, happy to do it.
Thank you so much to both of you. And for those of you looking for the third session, we will have details on the third session as soon as I can make them available. Just check out our website and you'll see the updates there. Thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank
Thank
y'all.
you.